Adelante, Tom.
Muy buenos días a todos y hoy es la última sesión, ¿no?, del seminario permanente interinstitucional en emociones, activismo y cambio social. Y para cerrar el año, eh, tenemos eh, una invitada especial, Asa Wettergren, que tratará una conferencia muy actual, eh, que el título es La esperanza en tiempos de crisis climática. Eh, ASA la presentará Alicia, del Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales, y, eh, y una colega que está trabajando desde el enfoque sociocultural de las emociones, también el activismo climático. Por lo tanto, será muy interesante eh, la presentación de sus investigaciones de la otra parte digamos, del charco, del océano, en Europa, para poder eventualmente comparar lo que está pasando en esta parte del mundo. Por lo tanto, bienvenida, Asa. Muchas gracias por participar. Dejo la palabra a Alicia.
Gracias, Tomaso. Gracias, Asa. Gracias, Paula, que está haciendo la traducción. Estamos muy felices de tenerte aquí, Asa. Gracias por participar, por estar con nosotros en nuestro seminario de emociones, activismo y cambio social. La doctora Wettergren es profesora de sociología en el Departamento de Sociología y Ciencia del Trabajo de la Universidad de Gotemburgo. Es una académica de reconocimiento internacional en el campo de la sociología de las emociones y desde 2012 su investigación empírica se ha centrado en los campos del derecho y las emociones y de las emociones en los movimientos en defensa del medio ambiente y clima. La doctora Wettergren es una de las editoras en jefe y fundadora de la revista científica Emotionalizing Society. Ha publicado extensamente en revistas internacionales y es autora de varios libros y volúmenes recopilados. Hoy nos hablará de esperanza en tiempo de crisis climática. Como decía Tomaso, un tema que a nosotros nos interesa mucho, a nuestra audiencia también, y que es fundamental en esos tiempos. Entonces, muchas gracias, Asa, y te paso la palabra. Voy a compartir tu PowerPoint.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice and Tommaso and Paula. Thank you for arranging this. I'm very honored to be part of this lecture series. It's really exciting. I couldn't share my PowerPoint myself because I had to enter via the internet because my computer can't take the Zoom update. But that said, I think we will manage well anyway. And I'm very happy to present this paper or article that I actually published in or was published in Emotions and Society. It's the first paper I published there myself as an editor of the journal. Of course, it was passed through other channels than myself. But it was also, I think, a very appropriate article for the journal. So that said, I also want to encourage everybody who does write about emotions, scientific articles about emotions, to submit to the journal. We very much would like to see more contributions from, especially Latin America, for instance. What I'm going to talk about today is emotionalizing hope as collective emotion in critical times. And we can change the slide. It's based on a project that I did together with my colleagues, Professor Carl Kastegård and lecturer Carl Malmqvist at Gothenburg University, 2021 to 2024. It was called Emotions and Narratives in the Climate Movement. It was externally funded. What we were looking at then particularly was two different groups. No, you can go back. Thank you. Which we call transitioners and collapsologists. And transitioners come from the transition movement, which you might be familiar with. It's a movement that started in the early 2000s in the UK and has spread at least quite a lot over Europe. And the other group call themselves collapsologists, and that started in France about a decade ago. And was started by scientists basically, and they're not so much a group or a movement as really a group of people whose main point of sort of united action is to discuss different horrific things that they think are going to happen on the internet in different Facebook groups and so on. But they do have similarities, and they're all very concerned about climate. And that said, the collapsologists are not preppers. They would perhaps be situated as collective prepping in a way, but they're definitely not any hardcore right-wing people or any such thing. So I will get back to who they are. In any case, we did 32 in-depth interviews with people from these two groups, and we wanted to look at how they talk about the present, the past, and the future, and what types of emotions they displayed. And then doing that, we came to this complex of hope. So you can change the slides now. Basically, we came across two different concepts of hope. The transition movement people or the transitioners, they talked about active hope, and the collapsologists talked about no hope. So I will just give you a short illustration of how they conceive of the present and the future. So the transition movement, they are focusing on transition villages and trying to build villages that they think will be resilient for the future climate changes and the future other types of crises and challenges. And their notion of active hope is captured in the quotes here by Joanna Macy and a co-author John Stone, on which is a book called Active Hope, actually. So the book, the quote, I will read it out loud for you. Right now, a shift of comparable scope and magnitude is occurring, and now she's talking about a comparable to the shift when society became fossil fueled, and that sort of sparked industrialization and present modernity as we know it. So a comparable shift is occurring, and she continues, it's been called the ecological revolution, the sustainability revolution, even the necessary revolution. We call it the great turning and see it as the essential adventure of our time. It involves the transition from a doomed economy of industrial growth to a life-sustaining society committed to the recovery of our world. This transition is already well underway. So here we see that it's very much a promising transition that they envisage in this quote. And if we go to the next slide. In contrast, then the collapsologists, whom, as I said, they tend to be scientifically well-oriented, and they tend to be engineers. They tend to be people who have been working in different companies with climate issues and transition, green growth issues, and they have read up quite a lot, and they have reached the conclusion then that this green growth and transition, electrification and so forth is not going to be possible, and we're rather heading towards some sort of a collapse. So they, Servini and Stevens, who wrote the book How Everything Will Collapse, which can be seen as one of their main sources, they write, in mathematics, an exponential function goes all the way up to the sky. In the real world, on Earth, it hits the ceiling long before that. In ecology, this ceiling is called the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. Regardless of what the optimists say, the times we live in are clearly marked by a looming collapse. So all those the chart here with all those curves going down is just to show that everything is basically going down now. So we can say that from this we can conclude that both the transitioners and the collapsologists believe that we are the society as we know it cannot be saved, and therefore they do not fight or protest or walk in marches because they think that that's not going to change anything, basically because the transition or the collapse has already begun, as we saw also that they said in the previous quote that they think that this has already begun. And that's why we also, as scientists, we call them post-apocalyptical climate activists. And activist is in terms of being active and trying to do something about the future they think is coming, whether they think that it's going to be rather terrible, as the collapsologists do, or whether they think it's going to be a new chance to live in balance with nature, as the transitioners do. So we can change slide. The problem for us when we came across these two different concepts of hope was that the transitioners claim that active hope is doing the better future in the present. That's what they do when they build their transition villages in balance with nature in the countryside. We have quite a few such villages in Sweden. And the collapsologists claim that hope is just bad, it's delusional. But they still do things to prepare for whatever they think is coming. So they also move to the countryside. They also do work quite a lot with local networking with the farmers and other people who live in the villages where they are themselves living. And both these groups, they claim that eco-modernist hope, that is hope, the mainstream hope in green growth and just electrification and you know the lots like windmills and solar panels and all these things is going to save us. They both argue that this is impossible. There is no energy source that can replace the power of fossil fuels, and fossil fuels will end either because we stop it ourselves and then we might not have such a horrible future, but or we can control the transition in a way, or it will end because it will end simply, and because all the other resources that we need for building, for instance, car batteries, all the rare earth minerals and all those things are also being depleted. So basically growth is out of question, and we have to reconsider society from the start. But so they say that's hopium, or they call it passive, stupid hope. And hopium is a nice word for it. But it's interesting that also the collapsologists claim sometimes that they have tried being in the transition villages. They have tried that. Some of them have tried to be part of the transition movement, but they think that their hope is also hopium. So they say, no, we don't hope. And that is something that I found very intriguing, because I thought that's simply not true. Because for me, and also in previous research, I've seen that hope is quite something that is also, if not growing out of action. So when you do take action towards the future, you engage with the future, and therefore there should also be some sort of hope, right? So I wanted to theoretically look into what is hope. We can take the next slide. So how can we make sense of hope as a value free, in terms of not stupid, not active, not good, not bad? I mean, that just, hope is an emotion. What makes it good or bad is not the emotion itself, or negative or positive. And that, as a sociologist of emotion, that's something that I stress all the time, that we talk about negative and positive emotions, but no emotion is really in itself negative or positive. What is negative or positive is what you do with the emotion, or what you attach, sort of the sources and objects of emotion. So we need to look a little bit on that before we go on to what kinds of hope we're looking at here. And yeah, we can, how is emotion connected to action, and how can emotion be prompting different types of actions depending on its sources and objects and so on. So we go on to the next slide. Now, interesting as a sociologist, the thing with emotion is interesting because it might give, it orients and fuels action. So it might give rise to action. It's not a one-to-one relationship. It's not like I feel angry and therefore I hit someone, or therefore I go out and scream. It's not that simple, because it's more complicated, as we will see soon, in terms of thinking ahead, what happens if I act on my emotion, right? And then you have other emotions about your emotion of anger, like shame. If you go and hit somebody in the face, you know that in the future I will probably feel ashamed of myself if I do that. So you stop yourself. You might also work on your emotions and all those things. And that's sort of a detour here that I can't go into, but because you have listened to Arlie Hochschild, so about feeling rules and how we work on emotions cognitively, but also because we feel about what we feel. So action, in any case, as soon as you take action, you're actually acting towards the future. You're creating the future. You're doing the future, right? Because whether the future is the next moment, or the next day, or the next week, or in many, many years from now, every time you take action, you are engaging with some sort of a future, very, very short term or long term. So that is one of the premises of my looking at hope. And emotions have temporal orientations, you could say. I mean, it's interesting to note that some emotions are more oriented towards the past, like nostalgia, whereas other emotions like hope are more oriented towards the future, like have a primary orientation towards the future. And emotion also connects the past to the present and to the future. And so what we have, the experience we have from the past are things that we feel about how things should be or how things can be. It's also the import of what past action has brought in terms of outcomes and how that made us feel. And that orients us in the present when we take action towards the future. So emotion connects past, present, and future. So it flows through that, if you wish. And that brings up the issue of emotional reflexivity that my colleague Mary Holmes has written about quite extensively. And that is raising the issue of emotions about emotions, as I just said. So you reflect on, if I act on this emotion, if I let this emotion lead me to action, then what will I feel about it in the future? And if I act this way, what will I feel in the future, and so on? And how will it affect my relations to others, and how will others feel about me and my place in society, or my status, so to speak? So particular emotions, I argue, particular emotions, because now I've been talking about emotion as a generic concept, and so we're talking about the moment we start reflecting on emotions, then we start thinking, oh, what am I feeling? I'm feeling fear, I'm feeling sadness, I'm feeling hope. But as long as you do not really reflect on them, they're just in the background, feeding and orienting your action. So when you look at a particular emotion like hope, it's usually because it's, in one way or another, a problem or something that you have to think about, like, why am I afraid, or what am I angry about, or what is hope in this situation? And that's what I call a foreground emotion, an emotion that breaks through consciousness and requires conscious reflexivity. And then I suggest in my model in this paper that you may start reflecting both emotionally and cognitively about the sources of emotions, the target of emotions, and the object of the emotions. And how you decide to act depends on things like your values, your knowledge, your experience, everything you bring in from the past. And that's what we call background import in this paper. And then, of course, as I said, you reflect about the outcome of the object. If I act this way, this thing is going to happen. That's what I call the object. And then that will affect the world in this and that way. And that is something you have to think about before you act, because you don't really know, if you want that outcome or not. Maybe it's a bad outcome considering your values and your background import and so on. So this is just captured very simply in the model that is the next slide. And what this is, and I'm not going to dwell on this because I really want to speak more about hope. So the only thing I want to say here is that in the present, you identify the source of emotion, the source of anger, the source of fear, the source of hope, for instance. And also the target of action is the one that you sort of think that, okay, in the present, I'm angry on Donald Trump, for instance, and I will not vote for Donald Trump. That could be an action that comes out of that identification of anger. Or in hope, I will argue that the target is always the present, because the present is bad and you want that the bad present to change somehow. The object is in the future, and the object is the outcome, or the object outcome of your action. So when you think about the outcome, it feeds back into your background import, like, okay, is this something I like? Is this an outcome I like? Like I could imagine, doing something bad to Trump, for instance, but is that a good thing? And what will happen if I try to do that? And how will that affect the world and myself and so on? So maybe I choose to do something else. And so on. So this is a bit what I would call the cognitive chain of evaluation, because it's a temporal chain. It's moving in time. And when it comes to the foreground emotion of hope, important thing is that when hope is a foreground emotion, a very sort of important emotion to reflect on in present times, because we ask ourselves, is there any hope? Then of course hope is going to be processed in continuously, right? Because what can we hope for? Can we hope for the UN COPs to change things? No, we can't. So we have to reassess hope and so forth. Okay, we can go on. So back to hope. Under extreme conditions, as I said, characterized by heightened uncertainty concerning both external circumstances and individual or collective actors' agency, hope emerges as the most salient foreground emotion. So that's basically what I said. I can add that the external circumstances is for hope where you find sources of hope, where you identify a source of hope. And we'll come forward to that. So go ahead. So I argue that hope is a future-oriented emotion premised on uncertainty, and the uncertainty goes both for your own agency, because if you felt certain about your own agency in terms of reaching a desired goal or the thing that you hope for, then you would not need to hope, because then you would rather be feeling self-confident or confident that you would reach this goal, so you don't need to hope, actually. I mean, if we really sort of go down to the nitty-gritty. Now, in real life, this hope and confidence might, of course, appear together, but if we sort of try to isolate hope now, what is specific about hope? It's not faith, because faith is more certain than hope. It's like, I believe God will fix this for me, so I feel fine. I don't need to do anything. I don't need to hope. I just know that God will fix this for me. Or trust, which is a commitment to believe that something good is going to happen. I trust you because I believe that you will actually do something good for me, or I trust that the authorities will do this. They will deal with this climate change predicament. So I don't need to do much, actually, and I don't need hope because I feel trust in the government, for instance. So the important thing is then that when you need to hope, it's because you feel that I cannot reach this on my own account, or we as a group cannot do this on our own. The other premise of hope is that the present is bad, in the sense that there is a possibility of improvement. It doesn't need to be very bad, but I think when we're speaking about climate change and when we're speaking about climate change activism, it is defined as really, really bad and really urgent. So, and we can stay with that and not go into the other possible situations where we might hope where the present is not so bad. But in any case, Lazarus here says that a fundamental condition of hope is that our current life circumstances is unsatisfactory, and we're concerned about what's going to happen. So there is some element of fear as well, and hope that there will be a change for the better. And then, of course, the external circumstances from where you might try to identify a source of hope, they are unpredictable in the present times. We don't know what's going to happen. This is very clear in the narratives of the transitioners and the collapsologists, because they say, well, we don't know when things are going to go down the drain. We don't know when people are going to start fleeing from the cities and come to our transition villages. We don't know when we're going to have a problem with fresh water. We don't know when there will be a problem with food. We don't know when, now they're talking about the collapse of the AMOC, the Atlantic streams, and we don't know when that's going to happen, but that will be really bad news for us living in Northern Europe, so because it will get really cold. So we don't know when a lot of things, but it's certainly unpredictable and unknown in terms of the big events that will affect us massively as a society in the future. So, okay, go on. So when it comes to the past, as I said, as a foreground emotion that is assessed over and over again, assessing hope here in this context of climate change requires almost that you have experiences of past failed hopes. And you see that also quite clearly in the transitioners and the collapsologists, because the transitioners were hoping in eco-modernist green growth future. Like they believed that, they were working with that as in their different positions at their different previous jobs. But then they realized that that's not possible. We can't hope for that. And then they had to reassess their hope. And maybe they tried to do that over and over. Some of them actually said that they have been through periods of very, very hard climate anxiety and depression, and then I realized I have to do something. So I took my family, we bought a country house, we sold our house in the city, and we moved to the country, and we bought a house there and started growing our own food and making friends with the farmers around and the people who live here and so on. And now that sounds very hopeful to me, but they would still say that they had given up hope at that point, right? And the transitioners say, oh, I used to be an XR activist, I used to be this, or I used to do that, and I used to write petitions, and I used to work as a politician for the Green Party, but now I realize that there is no hope in that, so I turn to the active hope of the transition villages. So it's past failed hopes that are being reassessed, something else to hope for. So I say that the present bad situation is a target of hope due to past failed failed hopes that have made the situation even worse. Everybody claims that now the situation is even worse than when I first started to be concerned about climate change, because we see what's happening. We're basically just rushing towards the end of at least if we listen to the IPCC scientists, right? And the assessment, given past experiences, what can be hoped for now? So given that we can't hope for, the sources of hope cannot be the government, it cannot be the climate scientists, it can't be all those world leaders, what can we hope for? What is the new source of hope? So where do we find the sources, and what can the new object be? Is it going to be like continued green growth? No, it's not. We have to imagine a different object, like a different future, a different kind of society. And of course, then based on what you value and all those things, the background input, the stocks of knowledge, cares, and interest that shape the emotive cognitive evaluation and what you think is a desirable outcome of action, and the imagined future. What is it going to look like? The different hope object, and how do we want it to look like? So, for instance, I mean, the collapsologists, I imagine, could very well just build their bunkers and buy a rifle and say, I will protect my family. But they don't do that, because they also believe that in order to survive in the future, you have to have good, sustainable networks around you. And that means that you can't just isolate yourself and think of your own good. You have to do this together with other people. So in that sense, what you hope for in this situation that we are in now shapes the future and then the way the society in the future will look. So we can go on. Now, I would mention that there is an element of fear in hope because the situation now is bad and it has gotten worse. We have left the hopes, we have past failed hopes, and the situation has not got better, it's gotten worse. And so what we fear for the future is, of course, that the situation is going to get even worse, right? And everything sort of tells us that now. We hear that, we're rather looking at 3 degrees increase in temperature in 30 or maybe 2100, and of course, that would make our situation much worse than where we are now at this point. So that is the fear, basically. If you look at the big picture, then of course you can identify different other sources of fear, which the collapsologists do in terms of objects of fear, what's going to happen, fear objects in the future, like wars, pandemics, and all those things that we already know is happening. And of course, also increased authoritarian turns and all those things. These are fear objects of the collapsologists. They discuss quite a lot. But also famine, lack of drinking water, the climate refugee crisis that's going to happen and how to deal with that. I mean, both inside the countries when the people come from the cities to the countryside, but also between countries. And what are we going to do? What's going to happen to our humanity? Already we see that the idea of migration is like how people consider that in the rich countries is sort of like total opposite of what they did, at least in Sweden, say 2 decades ago, where we wanted to be good to migrants and take care of refugees. But now the opposite is happening. We're closing our borders just like everybody else. So that's also fear objects identified by the collapsologists that depend on and come from or originally sort of are rooted in the depletion of resources and the destruction of nature and the climate catastrophes that are happening. But interesting now is that hope is a wish for the possibility of the bad present to get better, and that's going to happen. Whereas fear, if you look at it, is a wish for a possibility or probability, the bad present that gets worse, that is, to not happen. So they're looking at 2 sides of the same coin in the future when it comes to climate change. And we argue in a previous article, Jochen Clares and I, that fear is an action-motivating emotion supportive of hope, in the sense that many of the climate activists we then talked to said that their fear of what was going to happen in the future was actually prompting them to get engaged in climate activism. And when they were engaged in collective climate activism, hope grew out of that. So in that sense, fear is important, sort of companion, if you wish, can be an important companion of hope. And I also think that we should look more at fear's role as important for identifying possibilities to avoid or contain the fear objects, and therefore also to think about the outcomes of our actions in the present and what we hope for and what we can hope for and how we should do to attain that hope, given the things that we also fear. So we can go on to the next. So just to take briefly my definition of hope, if you wish, as an emotion, is that hope is the emotion of future possibility, which is the object of hope, shaped by stocks of knowledge, interest, and cares, which is the background import. An evaluative feeling of limited agency, which is a sort of premise of hope, that I or we cannot reach it on our own. And very uncertain external circumstances in a bad present, which is the target of hope, relating to past experiences of failed hopes, which is the outcome of hope, past hopes. The emotion of future possibilities accompanied by fear that the bad present may worsen if action is not taken. Therefore, fear motivates action despite uncertain circumstances. In cases with no identified possibilities, no hope situations, fear may be coped with by taking action, which through action's practical engagement with the future generates new possibilities, that is hope. So, go on. So, another important thing that I'm looking at in this article is the importance of collective hopes and of hoping together. And there is this relies on I think she's a psychologist or philosopher who is called McGeer, and she talks about what she calls effective peer scaffolding. She says that individuals who hope together, they scaffold each other's hope, so they help each other to keep the hopes up and to also reassess the hope when the hope fails, so the hope becomes more tenuous. And she says that when you do that together with other people, when you hope, even if you have it's hope for yourself, inevitably your own hope will also become the hope of others and so forth. So you help each other to build a collective hope in a way. And you're also, I should call it, naturally drawn into a kind of community. And existing within such a community makes hope less likely to slide from disappointment into the passivity of ongoing despair. Now, when I look at collective hope, I also draw on von Scheeve and Eastman and their idea about collective emotions. What makes emotions collective? And how do they become collective? And what is the quality of a collective emotion as compared to an individual one? Von Scheeve and Eastman speak about two different modes, if you wish, of collective emotions. The I mode, where the individuals share some aspects or some elements of the background input, that is care, values, and position in society and outlook on the world and so on, but do not feel as a we, basically. And you could definitely say, or I try to argue, that eco-modernism is a worldwide, in a way, collective hope in the I mode, because it's the message that is being sold and processed in the media and by the cops and everything all over, which we are still aiming for is green growth by turning into every industrialization into a green variant and greening the energy sources and so on. So in a way, we don't feel like we're part of a community with people in India or the US or in Latin America, in Sweden, but we all share this idea about the eco-modernist hope, right? In that sense. So in that sense, it's a collective hope, but it's not in the so-called we mode, where the we mode requires a more integrated background input. And that is what we see is coming out of the work they do in the transition villages, where they actually do work as a community and where they do process their hopes and their fears and so on, and together start building a village where they will live together and where they exchange different tools and so on, and where they basically become a we and start feeling on behalf of each other. So it's not even what they're thinking about is not even their own future, but their children's future. And the we mode of an emotion then is feeling on behalf of someone else, and not feeling on behalf of yourself primarily, but also feeling what happens to others happens to you. And that is the more integrated version of a collective hope in the we mode. Now, the interesting thing with the collapsologists is they also do this. They also work in villages and in networks, and they are all active in various ways. But they still say that they stick to the no hope, that there is no hope. And they still tend to have a very high focus on discussing the reasons why there cannot be not be any hope, because we know that all those fear objects is going to happen. So we go on to the next. So here I want to stick in with a notion of what I call realistic hope. It's not so often discussed, but the other variants like wishful hope, you already heard hopium and stupid hope. But we can also, the literature, the Mackier, for instance, speaks about wishful hope and willful hope and all kinds of sort of hopes that actually are not so realistic. They're hopes, but they don't seem to be in tune with the actual circumstances or what can actually be reasonably hoped for. Like if I put all my money on a horse and I hope to become a millionaire, it's a bit of a wishful hope, right? Now it can happen, but the chances are very low. And there I argue that in this context of climate change, realistic hope can be seen as fear, can be reached by fear as a sort of a reality check. So what are we afraid of? And if you look at the fear objects, people tend to avoid them. Also, also the transitioners tend to avoid them. Actually, as we see in our interviews, they don't really want to talk about it so much. And when you look at the eco-modernist hope, you definitely see a sort of denial of trauma, as argued by Bryll and Norgard in the 2019 article, where they say that it's so interesting how no one, no politicians, no leadership, no Green Deal in Europe, and nothing is ever talking about sacrifice and what might be the possibility of no growth, or what might happen then, and how we're going to share whatever we have so we get equal access to food and water, for instance, instead of just continuing the same track of economic perpetual growth as we are believe that the green eco-modernist hope is sort of promising us, right? And if we're going to do some sacrifices, if it takes some sacrifice to shift your car from a fossil-fueled car to an electric car, then it's certainly not an eventful sacrifice. It's not a big one. It's doable. So sensible eventfulness is something that has been said to characterize the eco-modernist denial of trauma. And if you look at fear then as a resource to orient attention to what might actually happen, then you can use the IPCC science to look at the feared future in terms of what is expected to happen if we continue on this track. And given what is expected to happen, because science says that this will happen, we just don't know when, then you can identify the possibilities in view of these things that might happen or that is expected to happen. And that is where you can sort of identify the realistic hope objects. And so I argue that a balance between fear and hope makes hope more grounded in real circumstances. Of course, we could have a long discussion about how mainstream hope could work with this figure and actually come up with a much more realistic hope than the eco-modernist hope, but I'm not going to get there now, so we go on. But the point I want to make here is that when everything looks really, really shitty dark, as it does to the people we have interviewed in this project, and I think increasingly I was also thinking about that probability that the things are going to get really bad, then looking at what the fear objects actually are and discussing them, talking about them is a way to collectively together. And obviously I push the point that this has to be done together. It's not an individual's work. It's a collective work. And together we can assess what can be hoped for, what the hope objects can be. And the source of hope will always then be the community that who try to prepare ourselves together for the future in a bit, in a way like the transitioners do. But it's interesting that, as I said in the beginning, and also to resolve this first question, like what is this no hope thing? The thing is that the collapsologists, as we see here, collapsologist Eric a short quote which is illustrative of how they reason. It says, well, I try not to hope, because it says it doesn't give me anything good. It just, if you feel anxious, then do something instead. In any case, it is more meaningful than just to sit around and hope. So to him, all hope is passive and all hope is pacifying in a way. And then you see the hope explanation of the transitioner Ron here in the quote underneath. Hope, it's when we come together, when the movement comes together and sees itself and celebrates what we have done, or the mere fact that we are there, that we share the same vision and hope and fear. And yes, when we are together, then it feels hopeful. And this is, I think, a very balanced notion of hope. But we also had quite many transition interviews with transitioners where they would say, well, I'd rather not think about the wars and the famine and the depletion of resources and lack of water and all those things. And we also had ex-transitioners who turned into collapsology, like Rakel here on the right hand side, who said, well, I've tried to be a transitioner, but they were too, celebrating all the time. Celebration is one of their things, right? They were celebrating all the time. They were believing in this fantastic future of the eco villages, and I didn't find any place where I could talk about my fears, and the fears that sort of torment me and that I can't let go of, and I need to talk about them, because if I don't talk about them, I can't feel hope, basically. So Rakel here said, to me, hope is maybe this thing to care about each other, to help each other, to be in this hardship and dare to be weak. We cannot be but weak when you're facing these enormous forces that run amok in the world, the capital flows, the climate, and the devastated ecosystems. Like when we run out of water, no more clean water, groundwater. It's so many dimensions. And the only hope, this is where I feel that we must talk more. Like, how can we still stick together? How do we keep ourselves together? And how do we get this small world and this small achievement to survive with a sense of community that makes us strong enough to go on and to trust that we still somehow will survive? And I think it's interesting that you mentioned trust here also, because as I said before, trust is a commitment to believe. So it's also a commitment to believe in the we. We will survive. And when she says we, she's not talking about herself. She's talking about future generations and about humanity, if you wish. So this is an interesting, I think, balanced notion of how you can balance fear and hope and try to live with the fears and still identify the hopes. Whereas quite many transitioners could develop into some sort of wishful, even willful hope, believing that we as a community, we can actually reach, and then you're more talking about confidence in the future, but we can actually reach this balanced with nature and restore nature. They also talk about restoring nature. So these are different takes on hopes, basically, and I think that the fear-hope balance is best represented in Rakel's quote here. So next, I see I'm really good that I come to the conclusion. Sorry for pulling over time. So hope is the emotion of future possibility premised on limited agency and uncertain circumstances. When hope becomes subject to emotive cognitive evaluation, past hopes regarding the target present have likely failed. So we're sort of reassessing the hope regarding the same bad target present, right? And that is also hope as a foreground emotion in climate crisis, in times of climate crisis. Fear accompanying hope can be either suppressed to boost hope or magnified and then kill hope. So they're trying to do that all the time. The collapsologists say there is no reason to hope because all these fear things are going to happen. We know that they're going to happen, right? As collective emotion, hope is responsive, but being responsive in a collectivity doesn't necessarily make it a realistic hope, and that's important to remember. It's not just because we get feedback and scaffolding from other people who say, yeah, that's a good hope, you're right on track here, it's viable. It's not necessarily so, as we see with the example of eco-modernist hope. Now, it's very important, and I think this present action creates the future should actually not be under this bullet here, but anyway, present action creates the future is a main thing that interests me in why people, how people conceive, what are their future imaginaries, how do they conceive of the future, because what do they hope for or aim for in the future, because that is very much determining what we do in the present. And the collective hope in the we mode, the community-based, provides solace and support in very critical times. That's for sure. So even if the hope is not well adjusted, it can be very, very good to just be in a collective and be together and do things together. That's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asa. It was very, very interesting and perdón, Paula, no vi el horario porque fue muy interesante y muy necesario, la verdad. Estaba justo apuntándome ideas y yo creo que...
Thank you. Good.
Bueno, dicen que podemos quedarnos un poco más en el canal en inglés sin problema. Y de todas maneras, lo que yo estaba pensando para hacer un primer comentario, bueno, dos cosas principalmente, ¿no? Sí, una de las dudas es si los que ya están enfocados más en el miedo, en el colapso, llegan a sentir cierta resignación o de todas maneras, aunque no quieren sentir, ojo, esperanza, no están resignados. Y la segunda duda era sobre manejo emocional, emotion work management, pensando en Oakshield, ¿no? Me llamó la atención que The Collapsologist dijo, I try not to hope, intento no sentir esperanza. Y en los movimientos sociales estamos viendo muchas veces la evocación de la esperanza, seguir teniendo esperanza a pesar de todo. Entonces me llamó muchísimo la atención dos tipos de manejo emocional muy diferentes entre el seguir cultivando, seguir teniendo esperanza y esa gente que dice, no quiero sentir esperanza porque eso me hace daño. No sé si quieres decir algo alrededor de esto, de la resignación y del manejo emocional, si lo has estudiado.
Yes, thank you. That's good. I think the resignation. Well, that's the thing, right? That's what made me so puzzled when it comes to their insistence on saying that we don't hope. But to me, as I said, the fact and mind you, they came there. I think they have been in a situation of despair. They have been in a situation of despair and resignation and personal collapse, because many of them talked about long periods of climate depression and climate anxiety, and how they eventually pulled themselves together and thought, well, I have children, because most of them do, and I have a family, and if I really don't believe there is any future, I still have to do something to prepare for that future. So that's basically what propels most of them to do quite radical things, at least if they're younger. I also talked to older collapsologists who were just sad because, being 75 and you have grandchildren and you don't believe there is a future really for these grandchildren, you feel really, really sad about that. And it's not for their own part, but for their grandchildren, and they don't really change their own life because it doesn't matter, but they think a lot about their grandchildren, and they don't have any, then they demonstrate more kinds of resignation regarding the future for those children. But I think those people who actually do something and move to the countryside, they create hope by doing that. Now, on the other hand, it's a very hard, very tough emotion work. I have a colleague who wrote about the no hope work of the collapsologist Carl Malmqvist, whose name was in the. You can Google his. I think it was published in Social Movement Studies. But the interesting thing is that they wouldn't they will be in a community in the local areas where they live, but they will not talk about common hopes. So they will sort of keep their own no hope for themselves, and they also say that. But they sometimes even work in various sustainability initiatives in those communities where they live, but they cannot be open with their no hope. They have to sort of pretend that they think this is a good idea to I don't know, make the cars electric or whatever, or save energy is hopeful. Yeah, it is, but it's not going to save us, and so on. But so they work constantly with this sort of trying not to hope, trying to not be pulled in. But it appears that it's very easy to be pulled in into hoping, and so this active no hope work is really interesting to look at how they do it and what they do to achieve it. And I think I definitely recommend that you read Carl Malmqvist's article to look more in depth to that. And when it comes to the emotion work and the hope of social movements, I think that yes, that's the problem. I think when it comes to social movements, but definitely the transition movement is more of a social movement than and a environmental movement in general. Although they don't really mobilize, they just build these villages, and they hope that that initiative will spread and other people will do it too, and so on. But I think that that's the thing with collapsology is also that they try to stay away from this context because they don't want to be lured into this hopeful context where people actually encourage each other to feel hope about the common goals, because and as I said again, it's because they feel that they get out of touch with the fear objects, and they need to deal with the fear objects. So I think hope is a very powerful fear way counter emotion to fear, if you want. It can be completely making fear almost go away, but then again you feel that you have lost something. And for these people who are collapsologists, keeping track of the fear objects is important, because it's also some sort of a fear management. If you feel that you have some sort of control over a very uncertain future, if you have at least a minimum idea about what's going to happen, and you don't feel like, oh, now there's a war, oh, that's horrible. Instead, they can say, well, we knew that. It's like, check on that, right? And so in a sense, it's more of a relief, I think, when they feel that what they fear is actually happening, because that gives them some sense of control. So I think they might be people who actually feel that they need more control, and specifically that knowing the fear objects, it gives them a sense of control over very, very uncertain and very existential circumstances, both now and in the future. So I hope that was an answer.
Thank you very much. Tommaso, you can close.
Yes. Muchas gracias, Asa. De verdad, muchas gracias para presentarnos esta experiencia que no tenemos en América Latina, en México no tenemos. No hay grupos eh, de transicionistas, y por tanto es muy interesante. Tenemos que cerrar porque ya pasó el tiempo. Tanto agradezco otra vez a ASA para poder participar. Esperemos que el año próximo nos pueda presentar otros resultados de tus investigaciones. Con hoy cerramos el seminario de emociones y cambio social, y retomaremos el año que viene, el 25, con eh, nuevas conferencias dedicadas probablemente a la relación entre emociones y cambio climático. Por lo tanto, seguimos en contacto, ASA, para el año que viene, para poder intercambiar resultados de investigación, ¿no? Y nada, doy las gracias a Alice por participar, a Asa, Paola por la traducción, Víctor y todo el equipo de audiovisual de Sage. Muchas gracias y nos vemos el año que viene con una nueva temporada.
Thank you.
Ya Vic, ¿no?
Ya estamos fuera.
Ah, perfecto. Ok. Muchas gracias, Asa. Thank you so much.
Thank you.